Joseph William, or Joe Fedor, was my great-grandfather. His life has always intrigued and fascinated me. All I really knew was that he fought in World War II. The rest was unknown. I've always wanted to learn more about him. This is his story. Joe was born March 16, 1916, to Albert and Elizabeth Fedor. Albert, a coal miner, died in a mining accident when Joe was just 2 years old. His mother remarried, and Joe was raised by his stepfather, just as his own son would later be. He had 2 older brothers, and with remarriage, they were joined by 2 step-siblings and later 4 half-siblings. Joe graduated from high school in Uniontown, Pennsylvania in May. He enlisted in the Air Corps in December and was assigned to Langley Field, Virginia. He progressed to the rank of corporal 3 years later in November of '39, and his enlistment expired in December of the same year. He promptly re-enlisted and was promoted to staff sergeant in February. He also married Helen McClusack that year. He was also transferred to the 22nd Pursuit Squadron for a somewhat questionable reason, so that he could play on the baseball team. Apparently he was good. He wrote to Helen,
"After baseball season is over, I will get transferred back. We only have one more game before the playoff. We are in first place, 112, lost 2.
Of all the reasons to transfer someone to another unit, I suppose this is one of the most stereotypically American ones. He was transferred to Puerto Rico January 1st and made arrangements for Helen to join him February 18th. He wrote,
It's definite that we are leaving for Puerto Rico on or about December of this year. And at present, there are no living quarters available, so that means you're going to have to stay home until such a time that living quarters are available, and then I will send for you.
He also said that he wanted to get her a house with all the trimmings. He arranged for them to share a house with another man and his wife, and submitted paperwork to the base in Washington, D.C. to authorize her coming down on Army transport. She took the Chateau Thierry from Brooklyn to Puerto Rico and joined her husband. The next major event in their lives was the birth of their first child, a daughter, Elizabeth Ann. She was born and died on October 15th in Puerto Rico. He later wrote to Helen about her, saying,
I always think of our angel in heaven, and I'm sure that we would have loved her to death. But please don't worry about her, darling, because she is being watched over, and I'm sure God will give us another child soon.
They then moved back to the States, where Joe attended Officer Candidate School at Camp Lee, Virginia, and then Quartermaster School. Some of his letters to Helen indicate the Army's rapid expansion in preparation for a full-scale invasion of Europe. Their need for officers was clear. They rushed his training and graduation.
Due to the military situation, the Army needs a lot of officers sooner than they expected, so they've moved our graduations up. This course was previously a 9-month course, so we'll have to work 3 times as hard to complete it in 3 months.
He wrote this letter June 6th, soon after the first American Air Force missions were made in Europe. Joe graduated Quartermaster School August 14th and was also promoted to temporary second lieutenant. The standards were much higher in the U.S. Army than ever before because the Quartermaster Corps felt a strong responsibility to protect their troops and keep them as healthy as possible. This is evidenced in a paper by historian Michael Little, which reads,
Diet and nutrition were of direct interest to the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps because of its responsibility for feeding the troops. Energy and nutrient requirements were established under a variety of stressful conditions, including intense work activity, high-altitude residence, and extreme thermal environments, enhanced tolerance to cold and altitude, and improved night vision.
He qualified with the rifle and carbine this year, thus allowing him to wear the medals of marksman and sharpshooter, and was also promoted to first lieutenant. While Joe was still in training to become a quartermaster, Helen was preparing for the arrival of their second child. Like many soldiers, news from home was a highlight of his day, and he constantly complained that Helen's letters were too short and asked her to fill up both sides of the page. Joe was ecstatic when he heard about the baby. He wrote,
"Darling, I never thought I'd be a father at 25 and again at 27. Isn't it wonderful?"
Their son, my grandfather, was born August 26th. When he found out, he wrote to Helen, saying,
"Received the good news that I was a father this evening at about 5 p.m. I was so happy, darling. Glad to hear that you and the baby are fine, and you'll get well soon, and I hope the baby will be very healthy. What are we to name it, darling? Tell Junior his daddy says hello."
From then on, he wrote about his son in his letters often. He still tried to be a part of his life by telling Helen how to parent, which probably wasn't appreciated too much. He wrote things like,
"I sure would like to see Billy's teeth. Don't let him suck his thumb because his teeth will grow in crooked.
and
Sorry to hear that Billy is particular about his food. You shouldn't let him take after his old man like that."
for a man whose entire adult life had been spent in the military, his child was a little escape from all that. With his wife and son, he could be a normal guy amidst the stresses of war and his seemingly endless training courses. He finished his final quartermaster training course in February, and in March was transferred overseas to North Africa. He worked to help supply troops in Europe, seeing as the campaign for North Africa had ended the previous year. He arrived less than 3 months before D-Day would occur on the beaches of Normandy, and just before all the logistical difficulties that would develop with a constantly moving army. He wrote to Helen about being overseas, saying,
"I visited Casablanca for about 4 days. It was interesting. It reminds me a lot of Puerto Rico down here. I'm staying in a hotel. Another lieutenant and I are in the same room, which is very nice. The food is very good."
Here he was, trying to win a war across 3 continents, and he wrote home about the quality of the food. Was this intended to be evasive, protecting his wife from the horrors of war he was being exposed to? Or did he really care about the food that much? Joe may have been a husband and father, but he was a soldier too, and that meant he got his fair share of fun in. His letters speak of drinking, gambling, and the Victrola, and he asked Helen to send him money to repay his debts at least once. Despite his arguably foolish behavior, the conversation always came back to little Billy, and by association, the precious baby they had lost. Joe wrote to Helen about how he had felt on the single day she lived.
"A friend and I went home to get the clothes that you and the baby would need, and when we returned, Elizabeth Ann was already born, and the doctor said you were both fine, and I was so happy. And what a blow it was to me after I'd bought cigars only to find that she had quietly passed away. But please don't worry about her, darling, because she's an angel in heaven."
No matter where they were, what nightmares they were struggling with, every soldier longed for news of home. Joe knew he had a job to do, but all he really wanted was to be with his wife and son.
"I sure would enjoy seeing Billy dance and sing. I would love so much to see him, and you too, darling."
But then, everything changed. In early September, Joe was called to go to division headquarters to represent his base at an important conference. A few days later, on September 22nd, Helen experienced every military wife's worst fear. She received a telegram. It read,
Mrs. Helen F. Fedor, Brownfield, Penn. The Secretary of War asks that I assure you of his deep sympathy in the loss of your husband, First Lieutenant Joseph W. Fedor. Report received states he was killed 17 September in Egypt in an airplane crash. Letter follows. J. A. Ulio, the Adjutant General.
And in the span of 5 minutes, suddenly Billy was fatherless, and she had become a widow. She must have been shocked. His death was far from expected. He wasn't in an active war zone, doing actual fighting. He had what could be called a safe role in the war. No combat, just directing the flow of supplies. The Army Effects Bureau sent her some of Joe's personal items. David Coley wrote about the work that went into bringing the boys home to their families, even if it was in a coffin, in his paper, accurately titled The Last Detail. This work was done by the Graves Registration Service, which is now the Joint Prisoner of War and Missing in Action Accounting Command. This is a unit within the military that works to identify bodies and send personal effects to be returned to their family. They make sure that the bodies are taken care of and that the family knows where their loved ones came to rest. Helen had so many questions. By June of 1945, she was ready to start searching for answers. Her first move was to write to the Adjutant General, the man whose name brought her news of Joe's death. It came to light that he had actually died September 16th, not the 17th as had earlier been reported. He said,
I am sure you will realize that due to the enormous amount of work involved in handling casualty reports, errors in dates of casualties are sometimes unavoidable. However, any anxiety caused you in this connection is deeply regretted.
She communed with a missionary who had often visited an air base where Joe was stationed. He talked to her of others who had lost their son or husband in the same crash, discussed the unusual weather they were having, and asked for photos of Billy and Joe, trying to keep some remembrance of his American friends. Next, she wrote to the father of one of the other men. He replied, saying,
My heart indeed goes out to you, and I can understand your sorrow, as only those can who have experienced similar loss. You are very fortunate that you have a son, 2 years old, because in a sense your husband will live on in him. You probably know that all of the men were spared destruction by fire. Their bodies were all definitely identified, and that they are all buried in the same cemetery just outside of Cairo. Captain Ripley told me yesterday that if the plane had only been 200 feet higher in the air, it would have missed the mountain, and as it was less than 30 minutes from Cairo, it would have shortly returned to its base.
One major detail in an intramilitary memo contradicts this, however. The memo says the crash was between Suez and Cairo, and the pilot was about 45 miles off course. This is where the plane crashed into a mountain, 2,547 feet high, all consistent with previous information told to Helen. But most importantly, it states that the
cause of the crash was undetermined. All deaths were due to incineration and were considered to be in the line of duty.
Of the two accounts, the military one is more trustworthy. Somewhere along the line, someone tried to spare the family members the added hardship of knowing the boys had died in pain, and most likely on fire. The plane they were on was a C-46H, the Flying Commando. Historian Norman Palmer researched into the past of this plane's use in combat and discovered that it wasn't always the most mechanically sound. There are reports of the early version of this plane, the C-46, suffering mechanical difficulties as a result of the harsh climate and low maintenance schedule under which they were forced to operate. Despite improvements, this could be a possible explanation for why the plane crashed. Helen was never able to attain much more information regarding the circumstances of her husband's death. Most of the information was classified at the time. Now she just wanted her husband's body home. She contacted the War Department and through them the Graves Registration Service about the whereabouts of her husband's body. They gave her the exact location of his grave.
Heliopolis, Egypt, Row J, Grave 16.
And told of the possibility of bringing her husband's body home to the U.S. Finally, in early 1949, Joe's body was reinterred in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, where Helen was still living. Billy, all grown up now, remembers being presented with his father's flag at this service. Helen had remarried in November of 1948 to Joe DiCarlo, a former merchant marine. She had 3 sons with him, and though he wanted to adopt Billy, she wouldn't let him. She wanted him to keep the Fedor name. Joe DiCarlo died in 2007, and thus Helen outlived 2 husbands. In 2008, she had Joe Fedor's remains moved to the same cemetery as Joe DiCarlo's, actually 1 grave apart. Helen died at the age of 90 in 2012. She was buried between her husbands. The family has made efforts to locate the grave of Elizabeth Ann in Puerto Rico so that she can be buried with her parents, although it has thus far been unsuccessful. Billy married Jane Seigan in 1966 and had 3 children, and now have 3 grandchildren, all with the Fedor name as Helen wished.